Good morning. The Worcester Senior Center Distinguished Speaker Series continues today. We welcome Dr. Thomas L. Doughton, Senior Lecturer, Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, the College of the Holy Cross, with honors, which honors Black History Month, and we'll talk about the Worcester Black History Trail. We come today to learn about the trail project that began as a collaborative undertaking of the City of Worcester, the College of the Holy Cross, the Worcester branch of the NAACP, and the Laurel Clayton Project. The goals of the project are to document and highlight historical sites important to the understanding, the experience of people of color in Worcester from the colonial period through to the present, by placement of history markers, and digital dissemination of Worcester Black History Trail. Welcome, Dr. Thomas Doughton.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for those kind words. In some ways, although she may not necessarily appreciate it, Shirley has been an inspiration for those of us of my generation. Oh, you can't hear me, right? Okay. I'd said that thank you. Okay. I was thanking Shirley, and you're making certain that everyone has a sense of how important Shirley is to people of my age, just a little bit behind, as it were. And I was thinking recently about our first Black History exhibit here in the city of Worcester. Back in 1981 at Prospect House on Lincoln Street, Shirley was there. Shirley brought in that wonderful portrait that's been on the cover of Colored, of course, and used a lot, but that Shirley was one of those people supporting the whole idea of a hidden history to Worcester and Worcester County. And the 1981 exhibit at the old Prospect House on Lincoln Street was quite an experience for a lot of folks in the community here. We literally just put up photographs and documents and memorabilia on the first 2 floors of that building on Lincoln Street and invited people to come in for the month of February. And it was part of an interesting program that involved Betty and a lot of people in the community. But Shirley was there, and that was our first Worcester Black History exhibit, and that was in 1981 at Prospect House. So some of us have been working for a long period of time to try to convince everyone else that people of color just didn't land here in Worcester, as it were, and that people of color have been here in Worcester since the 18th century, and that the experience of people of color says a lot about Worcester and the context of what African American people experienced here in Worcester. It is not until the 1940s that people of color will constitute more than 1 or 1.5% of Worcester's population. So for many reasons, including that very limited number of people, it is amazing the kind of history that folks don't know and don't see here in Worcester. So this project has come about to put that together, and it has 3 component activities which are ongoing. One is the designing of Black History markers. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen them. There are currently 5 markers that are put up around town. One is at Westfield Street behind Kentucky Fried Chicken, which documents the Hemingway family, an 18th century soldier of the American Revolution, with a Native American wife who owned a substantial piece of property at May and Park Avenue purchased in the 1780s, for example. So that is a site that we thought needed to be documented. Similarly, there is a marker that is placed at Newton Square. I don't know if any folks have seen these markers. I can show you what they look like in a moment. There is one outside 40 Belmont Street that draws attention to the community that used to be there in the Laurel Clayton neighborhood, and the AME Zion Church location, which was, demolished in 1959 as part of urban renewal. A fifth marker is over on the Liberty Street area, which again is intentional. The marker there draws attention to a small community, an enclave of people of color who lived on what was a dirt path starting in the 1850s, which eventually became Liberty Street, and that area has been home to a lot of very important people in terms of Worcester's history. So these are the kinds of things that we've been putting up. But the Worcester Black History Trail has three activities. One is placement of markers. 5 are already in place. We're hoping in the next few months, with additional funding, to put in a second 5. But because many of the physical structures important to African American history don't exist anymore, a second part of the program is placement of small 4x4 bronze markers embedded in the sidewalks that will have very little information. I mean, for example, one of them would say, at this location lived Bethany Veeney, a formerly enslaved person from Virginia. And for more information, you would go to the trail descriptors that are going to enable people to drive around Worcester and go to different locations in the city. We've identified actually 30 sites that we consider of paramount importance to understanding history. And another part of the trail would then be for folks to go to the Holy Cross webpage for more detailed scholarly descriptions of some of these sites, so that people will have options in what they may or may want to do to experience the site. So what I had hoped to do today was to just give you some examples of material that the group working on the trail has considered important. We mark buildings as well as neighborhoods, locations, and individuals. And an example of a building, I don't have my magic clicker to highlight this stuff, but an example of a building is at the corner of Main and Foster Street. Actually, the Worcester Black History Trail has marked 11 sites on Main Street we consider important to our history, whether we're talking about John Doris, the famous whistling barber who toured New England but had a shop on Lower Main Street, Brindley Hall, which was for a long time the location of the local Civil War veterans, and certainly site of the Women's Convention at which Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass spoke. But, the sites on Main Street include Main and Foster Street, which is the location of a famous event in Worcester history called the Butman Riot, which took place in October 1854, when a federal marshal who had been involved in returning Anthony Burns to slavery in Boston a few months earlier had come to Worcester theoretically to apprehend a William Jenkins, who openly operated a barber shop, a successful barber shop here on Main Street in Worcester at the time, but was owned by someone from Lurie, Virginia, who was willing to pay to have him returned to enslavement. Mr. Jenkins had been living openly in Worcester for a decade, so everyone knew who he was. And when the marshal came to Worcester, flyers were put out alerting the community that this horrible person was here, et cetera, et cetera. In simplicity, a large crowd, an integrated crowd, assembled at what was the hotel located at that location at Main and Foster. And it was determined that it was unsafe for Asa Butman, the marshal, to remain in Worcester. Decision was made that Thomas Wentworth Higginson and George Frisbee Hoare would accompany Mr. Butman to Westboro, where he could get the train, because it was thought that it would be unsafe for him to even remain in Worcester for the train to Boston. He was arrested by Worcester officials for carrying a concealed weapon, and in being processed to leave town, he was assaulted by 4 men of color here in the Worcester community, and they were subsequently charged, and charges against them were dismissed. But to conclude this story, Butman had to go to Westboro, and this, in October of 1854, is the last attempt to capture a fugitive slave anywhere in Massachusetts. It was such an extraordinary event. It made the New York Times of the period. It was in all the newspapers, a great event. So there are activities like that that have taken place in the past, to which we want to draw attention. And a big concern for those of us involved with the Worcester Black History Trail is that we get the story right. So much of our history is misrepresented and distorted here in Worcester that it forces some of us to wonder, do they really care? Because it's not even important enough for them to get a right narrative. I mean, for many years, as an example, we had here in Worcester, Massachusetts, a multi-purpose human social service program named for Henry Lee Willis, who never existed. And if you go to the web, you will still see notices about Henry Lee Willis, an 18th century landowner in Worcester, a member of the Worcester city government, et cetera, et cetera. There is no such person who ever existed. Similarly, we were very concerned, and this is part of how the project came about, to be candid about it. We were also very concerned about that alleged honor roll in Lincoln Square. Again, it is another example of misrepresentation. There was a billboard outside AME Zion Church in 1943 at a time when almost all of the churches in Worcester had billboards encouraging people to enlist. That was a billboard, and I'm not sure how you describe it, that sort of black felt material on which you embedded those white characters. But it was a list of the 143 men and women who had enlisted up to that point in time. Now, somehow, the legend that it was an honor roll got started, and that it was an honor roll that the city took down when building 290, and they were going to return to the community, and it had something to do with some alleged segregated marching event with soldiers of color marching to Union Station separately from white soldiers in Worcester. None of this is factual. And that $15,000 stone, whatever it is, in Lincoln Square, some of us have wanted to blow up. Because again, it is not an honor roll. role, and folks were very disturbed that anyone from our community who signed up after December 1943 is not on that list. And the families of people here in Worcester are the same families that had put that together. So we had wished that the city council and people had asked us so we could have clarified. I mean, for example, Hollister and Stanley Guthridge and Mrs. Louise Robbins, for example, were the chairs of the church committee putting up the recruitment billboard. You know, all the city had to do was just ask, and people could have clarified some of that for them. So in any event, part of how this project came about is a concern in our community about misrepresentation of our history and what that says to us about politics of memory. Who is remembering what and for what reason? I, as a scholar, have recently been writing a lot about the toxic goodwill of uninformed white Americans who want to atone for mistakes in the past and just don't get it right. So this trail is about getting some of our history right. And this is an example of a building, and here is an example of a family we want to commemorate. Mrs. Ward was one of the last of the people born in slavery here in Worcester. And that next to Plumley Village is a playground that we mark on the trail, because originally the commemoration of Mrs. Ward was out at Great Brook Valley, but that first playground, for which a television network gave the city money, is now the Roberto Clemente Field. But we did want to draw attention to Mrs. Ward and her family, because it, not only was she born in bondage, but a part of Worcester's African American history is people coming from two communities between 1870 and 1910, coming from Newbern, North Carolina, and Camden, South Carolina. The people who come from Newbern start arriving as early as 1862 and 1863, because we document and also draw attention to white residents of Worcester who were providing formerly enslaved people in Newbern food, clothing, books, paying for teachers from Worcester to go to Newbern during the 1860s. So during the Civil War and after the Civil War, a significant number of people do come from Newbern, North Carolina. Older residents in our community could tell you that the churches here in Worcester, well until the 1950s and 1960s, had Carolina clubs remembering that fact of Newbern and Camden. Now, the Camden people come a little later, but again, they come assisted by white residents in Worcester trying to settle freedmen. By 1900, Worcester had actually become a southern community with almost 60% of the people of color in Worcester connected to these two communities, Newbern and Camden. And they had joined a relatively smaller African-American community here in Worcester that was composed before the Civil War of the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of people who had been slaves right here in Worcester. And the trail also draws attention to their experience. But let me see if I can just move this without... Okay. And when I say we draw attention to individuals, this is someone who's very important. He's actually a distinguished churchman in the AME Zion Church, Reverend Biddle, who did many stints here in Worcester. Depending on whose count you take, he is either the last, the second to last, or the third to last surviving of the famous 54th Regiment. He had volunteered as a young man, and we draw attention to him not only because of his role as a pastor here in Worcester, but also we want to make sure people appreciate the significant number of men from Worcester who served in the Civil War. Even though it's a small community, many of the men here volunteered, whether they were of mixed Native ancestry or African American ancestry. And this becomes important because after the Civil War, men will move here from Vermont and Connecticut who had served with Worcester men during the 54th. But Reverend Biddle, in the middle here, lives well until, the modern period, the 1930s. And as I've said, he had enlisted as a young drummer, as a teenager, and he may be the last, the next to last, or the next to last survivor of the 54th Regiment. And he always told great stories about Robert Shaw Gould and other people. But here we also draw attention to an Alexander Johnson, who was another drummer in the 54th Regiment. But men from this area served in the 54th Regiment, the 55th Regiment, or the 5th Cavalry Unit, which not many people know about. And we include on our trail the Veterans Monument in the city common, because there are 3 men of color who died during the Civil War, who are listed on the roster of people remembered there. And in one instance, it is a really sad situation of a young man from Worcester who actually, on the eve of the famous battle of Fort Wagner, was shot by friendly fire returning from latrine. And there is a great letter that was written to the women of the church here in Worcester describing the poor, unfortunate death of young Jimmy Johnson. So, we want people to be aware of that. And similarly, we highlight several sites that go back to the 18th century, because 1 out of 5 soldiers of the American Revolution was a man of color, either Native American or African American. And there are 16 men of color from this little village of Worcester who served in the Continental Army. It's an amazing statistic, as it were. And it is important for understanding a broader vision of Worcester history, because almost all of those men, or their widows in the case of people who died, received pensions. And people used these pensions here in Worcester to buy homesteads. So between 1790 and 1800, we have 8 people, families of color, showing up on the tax roll in Worcester because they were able to use Revolutionary War bounties and pensions to secure a neighborhood, or an enclave. And the first neighborhood they're going to secure will be around Washington Square, the train station. And we know a lot about that because Worcester historians refer to the area as Guinea, as it were, and it is described. So just to, again, we tried to take a comprehensive approach, and part of that has entailed encouraging people to rethink the relationship of Worcester to enslavement in the 18th century, and appreciate the fact that the leading elite wealthy families here in Worcester had slaves serving in their households. But again, this is not the chattel slavery of 19th century cotton plantations. Almost all wealthy families in this region had a family of quote-unquote darkies living in the attic. And it was a measure of their wealth and prominence in the community. Certainly, the leading family here in Worcester in the 18th century was named Chandler, and one of their townhouses, which would have been right across from City Hall, was indeed staffed by enslaved people. And we have been able to track some of these people through a variety of different methods. I mean, for example, the Chandler family monopolizes all of the town and county and state political offices until the Revolution. They are very prominent indeed. And we know a lot about them, as I said, because the first Judge Chandler was one of the benevolent slave owners who provided in his will that whoever would take a slave who had served the family well would receive additional cash and benefits to support that person. And we're able to trace that person to the present, so that part of what the project, as this particular project has been able to do, is confirm for many Worcester families of color a documentary record, son of, daughter of, back to, in some instances, as early as the 1730s and 1740s. So this has been very, 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 very important, as it were. And some things people know, other things people don't know. I mean, for example, I would challenge people here to tell me, where was the African school in Worcester? Or was there an African school in Worcester? Well, unlike Boston, New Bedford, Providence, and other locations, the public schools in Worcester were never segregated, so they never had to be integrated. And if we go back to the 18th century even, we mark what was the household of Isaiah Thomas, the patriot, the publisher here in Worcester, because he had people of color serving in his household, and he wrote a letter in the 1780s to a new school master who showed up in Worcester, who apparently sent what Thomas considered his black boy back home. And Isaiah Thomas wrote this incredible letter to the schoolmaster telling him that this was contrary to how things were done here in Worcester, and this is in the 1780s, and we have always sent our Negro children to school, so I am sending my boy back, and I expect him to be educated. Now, the African school was located where Via Restaurant is today, and the reason why is before Shrewsbury Street was an Italian-American enclave, it was an Irish-American enclave, and before it was an Irish-American enclave, it was a substantial African-American community. So that in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, before the arrival of desperate Irish immigrants who were going to overwhelm their neighborhood, what is now East Worcester Street was a street occupied by people of color. And the reason why is directly across from there I just, for me, it's always Boulevard and Pat Towing, but directly across from there, at the train station, was a cemetery, Pine Meadow Cemetery. So the people of color lived across the street from the cemetery. So the African school was located where Via Restaurant is now located, at that corner or across from there, because that was a black clustered neighborhood. And there has never been a black neighborhood in Worcester. There are working class neighborhoods of immigrants into which people of color were incorporated. I was recently speaking with someone from my family, and she was talking to me about Armenian American friends she has had since first grade. Because again, when people talk about Laurel Clayton as a black neighborhood, kids tell me the ghetto, Laurel Clayton. I say, well, wait a minute. A few years ago, well, a while ago, the Worcester Historical Museum had a wonderful exhibit on strength and diversity on the Finnish neighborhood and why Finnish Americans in Worcester consider Laurel Clayton their neighborhood. Although, you know, I had a grandmother who told us all we had to be very careful walking by the Suomi baths in the other bathhouse, because those were places where nasty white people took off their clothes and she didn't know what. So we had to walk to the other side of the street because we couldn't even walk in front of the Finnish baths. The first Armenian Apostolic Church in the Americas, North-South Islands in the Americas, was at Laurel Street at the top of the hill. So, you know, Armenian Americans will tell you, oh, the East Side, that's our neighborhood, right? Talk to Lebanese people. They will tell you this was their neighborhood. So the notion that Laurel Clayton was a black neighborhood is really skewed, and the History Trail wants to bring some of that up for consideration and try to get us to have a different understanding of Worcester. So that the trail, just as an example, the trail documents several clustered neighborhoods here in Worcester. Obviously, the Laurel Clayton East Side is going to become gradually a community associated with people of color, but it is a mixed working class neighborhood. Similarly, the John Street, North Ashland Street, Bowdoin Street area, which becomes another clustered neighborhood, is a mixed neighborhood. The neighborhood at Beaver Brook is a mixed working class neighborhood also. So, you know, there really are not separate neighborhoods, as it were. And that fact alone says something about what the experience of people of color here in Worcester has been, and why it may be different from the experience of people other places, and why we can't use those models. Now, obviously, in a formal academic sense, there are objectives to the trail that have to do with history, obviously. But on the other hand, there are things that we have there that we think are kind of comical and shouldn't be lost, whether it's John Doris, the famous whistling barber who actually toured the East Coast whistling, or other characters, one being associated with Judge Timothy Payne, an 18th century person, very proper, wealthy person at a time when class rank at Harvard College was determined by your family status. He had a number 4 rank. He married a Chandler daughter here in Worcester. The inventory of their estate includes Paul Revere silver, monogrammed for the all. You know, he lived very well. This was his house on Lincoln Street, distinct from his son's house, the Oaks, which some of you may know. Now, one of the great anecdotes in Worcester history associates Judge Payne. In 1774, with the so-called alleged start of the American Revolution, with the compelling people who were requested by the King of England to take control of the government of Massachusetts. They were called, "We summon you, mandamus councilors," appointed statewide. Well, that dissolved the Massachusetts government. It was really unacceptable to many people. Judge Payne was marched from his house on Lincoln Street to the courthouse here in Lincoln Street. And he was told he had to give a little speech declining this honor bestowed on him by the king. He gave this little speech, but after, he was told he needed to take off his hat to accept the sovereignty of the people, to recognize that the people were sovereign. He did not do this quickly enough, and one of the crowd of 3,000 people actually grabbed the hat in such a way that Judge Payne's powdered wig fell on the ground. And this creates one of the great anecdotes in Worcester history, because we are told by historians, though he be as black as the ace of spades, Judge Payne's slave, Worcester Winslow, picked up that wig and wore that wig for the rest of his life here in Worcester. Judge Payne never wore a wig again, but his former slave became the last person in the city of Worcester, the town of Worcester, to be seen wearing a powdered wig. So, I mean, we try to draw attention to characters like that, but other people who folks may not remember, I mean, or may not know about. You know, Irene Higginbotham is a good example. Folks know who she is? Good Morning, Heartbreak America, songwriter. Grew up on Chandler Street here in Worcester, for example. Now, some folks may know Zara Cully, who was Mother Jefferson on that sitcom, who grew up on John Street here in Worcester. Pardon? But folks don't remember her brothers, who are important jazz musicians. You know, Wendell and Ray Curley, her one sister who for many years was the designer and dresser for Marian Anderson, and two other sisters who became Broadway stars, but for some reason, I'm not getting there. But, so in any event, these are the kinds of things. It's a range of people from different periods, and if I can, I thought I had this down. Okay, it's moving forward. Thank you. Okay. So, you know, a lot of different kinds of things are represented in this. This is the Trumbull Mansion, which is on Massachusetts Avenue now, but was the 18th century courthouse, and reassembled and moved there by Louisa Trumbull. But in any event, one of the most important legal decisions in Massachusetts judicial history took place in this building. and it was in what is called the Cork-Walker decision. It is taken to be the end of slavery in Massachusetts, but it's actually more interesting than that because the way slavery is ended in Massachusetts, and this is a trick question for students. When was slavery abolished in Massachusetts? Well, slavery was never abolished in Massachusetts. It was extinguished because in the Cork-Walker decision, and Cork-Walker was represented by Levi Lincoln, a name that resonates in Worcester history, and his house is one of the sites, and his family is commemorated for a variety of different reasons with their interactions with people of color. But as represented by Levi Lincoln, Cork-Walker argued for his freedom, and the Supreme Judicial Court at the time ruled that slavery in Massachusetts had been, in fact, it had been de facto. But if one looks at a lot of primary source documents, one sees that the word slave doesn't appear in many of them. The term that is used is servant for life. So the court argued that there had never been a legally established foundation for slavery in Massachusetts. Therefore, all persons heretofore considered slaves must, in law, be free. So Massachusetts sidestepped the issue. Now, that doesn't address the thousands of enslaved people who had lived and died in Massachusetts before 1783. But it's a real curious song and dance that was done, because obviously there were slaves in Massachusetts, and if legally they were servants for life, they were still slaves. But that took place in this building, which is now on Massachusetts Avenue here in Worcester. So when I say we try to commemorate historical sites, it is buildings like this, Mechanics Hall, Brinley Hall, the multiple locations of AME Zion Church. I mean, AME Zion is now at its 5th location in Worcester. It has been at 4 other sites before ending up where it is today, just as an example. And we hope that the information that we find at the trail empowers people in a certain way. We do present some questions for people to consider. I mean, you know, one question that people have to consider here in Worcester is, what is the relationship of bi- and tri-racial identity to what is considered black community? I mean, it's somewhat interesting because in the period before significant migration from the South, a lot of people of color in Worcester have both African and Native heritage and show up in the state records documenting Indians of the region. So, I mean, all of this becomes a kind of a question that gets raised by this trail, and asking people to rethink history, but to move away from certain assumptions that people have. For example, in Worcester, as is true in many places in New England, pigmentation, color, says nothing about ethnicity. And where everybody may just seem black, as it were, to outsiders, well, when you talk with people of color, no, we have to, you have to consider Afro-Canadians, Afro-Caribbeans, Africans from Africa, all of these different people who make up the communities of people of color here in Worcester. And that's true throughout New England at this time, and that's a far more interesting story than many people realize. The The history of Cape Verdean people here in New England is part of our black history. The history of Jamaicans and other Caribbean people in Boston is part of our story. It is interesting that Afro-Canadians, for example, who in the 1880s and 1890s constitute their own community on the backside of Beacon Hill, have their own church, St. Cyprian's, because they are high church Anglicans. As far as other black folks are concerned, talk kind of funny and have different kinds of attitudes. Well, it is an interesting detail that almost all of the gymnasia owned by people in Boston in 1890s are owned by Afro-Canadians, including one famous boxer who lived here in Worcester for a while. So there's a range of stuff we've been trying to address with this trail. Some of it is historiographical, the big questions that concern historians. But some of it is also a relaxed attempt to present some parts of history that are for us amusing or interesting, as it were, and comical. And it depends on when we're talking about, because we remember a gallows that used to exist where Homewood Suites is at Washington Square right now, where a couple really interesting 18th century men of color are executed, extraordinary characters. So we have a range of different kinds of things we've been doing here, trying to, in roughly 40 different sites, tell a bigger story, and a story that is unknown to many people. And some of this is known in our community. So when I began by saying the city really should have asked people of color, is there a difference between an honor roll and a recruitment billboard? We would have said yes. And if someone had asked people in the community, what is the Beaver Brook neighborhood? We would have said, Beaver Brook maybe begins at Mason Street, but extends to the Beaver Brook playground. Please do not mount a major exhibit at the Worcester Art Museum that includes North Ashland Street and John Street as part of Beaver Brook, which for us was one of the shortcomings of that wonderful exhibit at the Worcester Art Museum of the bullet photographs, because more than half of the folks represented in photographs lived in the North Ashland Street, Highland Street area. And that was never part of Beaver Brook. No one living on John Street would have said, I live in Beaver Brook. But again, this sometimes becomes discouraging when we think that our history is not even important enough for the other people to get right. And, we just keep repeating the same things over and over again, and they don't necessarily have to be factual or accurate. So I'm supposed to ask if there are any questions, and I've run over my discussion time here, but...
Down at Washington Square, there's a new monument, North Pole flag. Most of the pictures are Korean veterans. That's the names of most of the Korean veterans.
Yes.
But even the racism that was present in my uncle went into Korea at the same time. The separate legal law was powerful at that time. But the separate legal meant that we all wore green. No
Yeah.
matter what color we were. We all wore green. So you can see that the black people were in green trucks wearing green uniforms, but only blacks were in the trucks. Coming back from the war zone are white people in green uniforms coming back. And that was daytime. The statues themselves and the pictures themselves that depict that battalion from Massachusetts represents they were going to war at night. And that's right at the train station. Those flags and that history right there should be part of your public presentation and what modern people are still facing.
Yes,
Under
but
separate but equal. So the
yes.
question was, how would we get rid of that attitude that goes with the separate but equal green thing? I don't get it.
Well,
No.
and I think some other folks would argue by telling the truth and speaking with accuracy about certain things. I mean, for example, if I look at the 144 names represented on the billboard poster, and if I do what I'm supposed to do as a historian in questioning that, I would then can say to you, a third of those people registered at Fort Devens and weren't even Worcester residents to begin with. So this idea of segregated marches to Union Station is something that Bill Coleman and crew invented, but it's not historically accurate. I've used up a lot of my time, but any quick question?
I just wanted to first thank you for doing the work and preserving history and sharing it with us. And I also wanted to point out our own African American history of Worcester. The quilt up there was put together beautifully maybe a decade or more ago by our African
Yes.
World Plate neighborhood and other important
This is the first time I've been here, so it's friend Shirley since Bill and Eleanor Holly days. So I used to, come when we were doing those lunches way back when with folks who had gone on.
And Eleanor was an artist.
Yes.
That as well.
So anything else?
Thank you.
I forgot the flyers, but I'm going to get them to the center so with the links to all more information. Not just those, but the overall, just one second, please. Just one thing before we go, because I just want to show. Just one thing before we go, if I can get back to the disc. Okay, this is what the markers look like. So this particular marker, for example, is already in place. And this is already in place, and this is outside 40 Belmont Street. Because a question becomes where to put these, as it were. So that's what one looks like, and this is what the Hemingway marker looks like over by Kentucky Fried Chicken. That is Hepzibah Hemingway, whose portrait is the Worcester Historical Museum. This is an illustration of some estate papers from Jeffrey Hemingway. So these markers were put in place, inaugurated This is what the John Street looks like, and yes, that is someone connected to me. That is my grandfather with the same name. That's my grandfather with the same names. That's someone connected to me. So, and these are Ward children, Orison Ward's children, who lived on Lily Street, which certainly is not Beaver Brook. So these are what the first 5 look like. This is from Newton Square, because Newton Square was owned by individual, Rejoice Newton was his name. He's an abolitionist, a supporter of African American causes, and when Isaac Mason, who writes a story of his life as a slave, is sent here to Worcester by William Lloyd Garrison and the Boston Vigilance Committee, he is housed by William Brown on Pelham Street and Ebenezer Hemingway until they find employment for him at Rejoice Newton's farmstead at Newton Square. So that is also documented. This is where he would have lived. And the last one, just to give you an example, and I would have showed these earlier, but I'm incompetent with the equipment, as it were. But this is from the Liberty Street, Palmer Street area. That is Charles Brown. And some of you may know or have heard of Martha Brown, Miss Martha Brown. She was a Worcester school teacher for a long period of time. That's a young picture of Martha. And this is also Sarah Wilson and her family who lived in that area. This is the home of Amos Weber, who is the subject of a very important study that became the first home for aged seniors of color on Liberty Street. It was demolished and people moved to another site that we commemorate at the corner of Mayfield and Parker Street in an empty field across from Big Y, which is where people operated a home for seniors for a long period of time. And these are some of the other people who lived in that immediate area. William Brown, Lemuel Brown, who is a World War I veteran whose letters to folks at home from France are really interesting at the American Antiquarian Society. And over in the corner here is Charles Clark, originally a free person of color who was employed as a day laborer at Fort Sumter on the day of the bombardment. And he ultimately joins the New York colored troops, but comes to Worcester after the war and was a very active member of the Worcester GAR branch, et cetera, et cetera. So these are what the first 5 look like, and the second 5 will look like this, but we anticipate greater success with the web material because these are expensive and permission, and it gets really complicated. But more material will be sent to the center here so that folks can follow through with some of this. It's a folder I forgot yesterday. Okay, thanks.